Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we wander through Cyrodiil's most forgettable faces. The merchants, guildmasters, and quiet neighbours nobody ever looks at twice, to uncover exactly what several of them have been hiding all along. A countess who charms her dinner guests keeps something considerably darker waiting behind her own basement wall. And one particular house guest at a quiet inn isn't remotely who the rest of the city assumes she is. A few of tonight's secrets might genuinely catch you off guard, so stick around and see how many you already had figured out. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. The Botanist's Blood Garden. In the southeast corner of the Imperial City's Temple District stands a modest house, the kind you'd walk past 100 times without a second glance. Nothing about its exterior invites suspicion. It sits among similar homes, unremarkable in size, unremarkable in upkeep, the sort of residence that blends so completely into its surroundings that most travelers never learn its address unless they're specifically looking for it. Inside lives a man named Amantius Electus, and if you strike up a conversation with him, he'll tell you exactly who he is with the easy confidence of someone who has nothing to hide. He's a writer, he says. He's working on a new edition of Lives of the Saints. It's the kind of introduction that invites no follow-up questions, the kind of sentence designed to close a conversation rather than open one. And for years, that's exactly what it did. His days unfold with almost suspicious regularity. He wakes right around 6 each morning and eats a long, unhurried breakfast on the main floor of his house. He then spends hours simply talking with his wife Caller, wandering their shared living space in the kind of comfortable domestic silence that only settles over a marriage that's been running smoothly for a long time. He breaks for lunch at a place called the Feed Bag, and then, every single afternoon at 2 o'clock without fail, walks to a shop called the Main Ingredient. He goes there, he'd tell you, to think about supplies for his research. If you asked him what kind of research a hagiographer needs alchemical ingredients for, he might not have a satisfying answer ready. Most people never asked. Most people had no reason to. In the evenings, he wanders the Arboretum until his bedtime, and on weekends, he barely leaves the house at all until well after dark, when he strolls the Green Emperor Way until midnight. It's a schedule so precise, you could set a candle's burn time by it. Caller, his wife, seems just as unremarkable, just as devoted to the small mundane rituals of a comfortable marriage. She jokes that her whole job is making sure Amantius doesn't leave the house with his clothes on backwards, that he's a genius who can't find his own socks, that keeping him properly dressed is practically a full-time occupation of its own. It's an image built for comfort, an image that asks you to smile and move on. She spends her days praying at the Temple of the One, wandering the district on the days she doesn't attend service, living a life so orderly it could be a metronome. If ever there were a wife you'd expect to know every one of her husband's secrets, it would be her, given how closely their routines are woven together. And yet, nothing in her own words, nothing in the way she talks about him, suggests she has any idea what he's actually been doing in the room directly beneath her feet. Beneath that orderliness, in the basement of that unremarkable house, something else has been growing. The first sign, if you ever go looking, is the smell of the place before you even see anything clearly. Then the sight. A desk crowded with potted plants, and around them, unmistakably, blood. Not a stray drop, not the kind of accidental stain that comes from a kitchen mishap. Bloodstains have settled into the floor, and the desk's surface, the the way stains settle when something has happened there again and again, methodically, over an extended stretch of time. A novice mortar and pestle sits nearby, tools for grinding down whatever those plants required as feed or fertilizer or something stranger still. There's a trapdoor leading straight into the city's sewers, an escape route built into the architecture of a hobby room, which tells you something about how carefully Amantius planned for the possibility of being found out. A man simply raising unusual houseplants doesn't typically need a private exit into the sewer system directly beneath his own basement. The full picture only comes together if you get your hands on his diary, which happens to be exactly what a trio of aspiring Thieves Guild recruits are sent to steal from him during a competition to prove their skill. It's a strange assignment on its face, stealing a scholar's personal journal, until you actually read what's inside it. The diary lays bare an obsession Amantius had developed with a specific kind of botanical experiment, cultivating a species of plant with genuinely vampiric traits, something that could feed and grow stronger the way a living predator does, rather than simply drawing nutrients passively from soil and sunlight. He started small, the way these things tend to start. Rats, vermin, whatever blood he could get without drawing attention, the kind of casual cruelty a man could tell himself didn't really count as anything sinister. But the plants, according to his own account, wanted more. They grew hungrier as they grew larger, and eventually the rats weren't enough to sustain whatever he'd cultivated in that basement. His diary describes graduating to human blood, and getting it meant compromising someone who had access to it freely. A healer. He bribed her, according to his own written admission, and paid extra to make sure she kept quiet about where her supply was actually going. Whoever this healer was, whatever excuse she told herself for accepting Amantius's coin, she becomes, through that single transaction, a quiet accomplice to something she likely never fully understood the scope of. There's something almost clinical about the way this is documented. One entry, brief and almost giddy, reads simply that he had planted the seeds of what he called the drinkers, and that soon he would know whether his theories held true. This wasn't idle curiosity. This was a man testing a hypothesis with the patience of an actual researcher, except his laboratory subject was designed to drink blood, and his funding came from bribing a member of the healing profession to look the other way. It's worth pausing on that word he chose. The drinkers. Not a scientific name, not a Latin-sounding classification borrowed from some herbalist's manual, but something closer to a title he'd given them out of a kind of dark affection, the way you might name a pet rather than a specimen. What makes the story land harder than a simple mad scientist tale is what happened next. Amantius didn't get caught. He didn't get stopped. Based on what his diary tells us and the state of that basement, he stopped himself. Something about what he'd created frightened him enough that he destroyed the plants outright, tearing down his own obsession before it could go further than it already had. Whether that was conscience, or fear for his own safety, or simple exhaustion with the whole macabre project, the diary doesn't say plainly, and one interpretation is as fair as another. Perhaps he watched the plants grow large enough that their hunger began to feel less like a curiosity and more like a threat sitting in his own basement. Perhaps he simply lost his nerve the way any amateur eventually does when a private hobby starts to feel less like control and more like something controlling him instead. What lingers, though, is the gap between the two Amantius Electuses. There's the one who greets you at the door, mild and forgettable, working on his book about saints, worried about matching socks, exchanging pleasant nothings with beggars and neighbors alike. And there's the one whose basement floor is permanently darkened with blood, who ground reagents with the same hands that fed a hungry, unnatural garden, who paid a healer in secret to keep human blood flowing into his private, hidden experiment. Somewhere in the middle of the Imperial City, behind a door nobody thinks twice about, a man built something he ultimately couldn't bear to finish, and then went right back to being the harmless writer everyone assumed he'd always been. His wife, as far as anyone can tell, never knew. She still tells you, cheerfully, that her biggest concern is his backwards clothes. She has no idea what grew in her own basement, no idea what her husband bribed a healer to obtain, no idea that the man she describes as absent-minded and lovable spent months feeding something that fed on blood. It's a small, quiet horror tucked into a domestic comedy, the kind of secret that never needed a grand reveal because nobody was ever curious enough to look. And that, perhaps, is the detail worth sitting with longest. Nothing about Amantius ever gave him away. No hostility, no strange behavior in public, no slip of the tongue. The only reason anyone ever learns the truth at all is because 3 strangers were sent to steal his private diary for reasons that had nothing to do with what it actually contained. Consider, too, what it means that this whole affair unfolds not because anyone in the Imperial City ever suspected him, but because a completely unrelated organization needed a low-risk target to test the mettle of its newest recruits. The Thieves' Guild didn't choose Amantius because his house held something dangerous. They chose him in all likelihood, precisely because he seemed so thoroughly unremarkable. A man whose diary would be easy to steal from someone unlikely to fight back or raise much alarm. It's a small irony worth lingering on. The very ordinariness that let his experiment go unnoticed for so long is the same ordinariness that made him an appealing target for a heist that had nothing at all to do with what he was actually hiding. Had the guild chosen literally any other quiet homeowner in that district for their initiation test, Amantius Electus might have spent the rest of his life exactly as he began it. A mild-mannered writer with an unusually blood-soaked basement nobody ever had reason to enter. There's something almost merciful, too, in how the story resolves itself without any of the violence you might expect from a tale this macabre. Nobody drags Amantius before a magistrate. No mob gathers outside his door once the truth gets out. In most versions of how this plays out, he simply continues his life exactly as before, still writing his book on saints, still eating his long breakfasts, still wandering the Arboretum each evening as the sun goes down over the Imperial City. The horror never gets resolved so much as it gets quietly filed away, tucked into a diary that ends up, ironically, in the hands of a criminal organization rather than any authority who might have done something about it. Whatever became of the drinkers themselves, whatever residue of that experiment still lingers in the soil of his basement floor, remains exactly where it's always been. Hidden, unremarked upon, waiting behind a door nobody in the Temple District has any reason to knock on. There's something worth noting too, in how carefully the diary itself is written, how a man capable of such quiet, sustained cruelty toward the plants and toward whatever creature supplied their meals could also produce prose measured and controlled enough to read almost like a formal laboratory record. That contrast between the cold, procedural tone of his private writing and the warm, absent-minded persona he projects to caller and to every passerby in the Temple District is, in its own way, the most unsettling detail of all. It suggests a man entirely capable of compartmentalizing, of stepping fully into one identity during daylight hours and fully into another once the basement door closes behind him. with neither version ever seeming to bleed into the other, where anyone else might notice. For a listener drifting toward sleep, there's a simple, uncomfortable comfort in imagining just how many quiet, forgettable homes across Cyrodiil might hold something similar behind their own basement doors. Not necessarily blood-fed plants, but some private project, some hidden hunger, patiently maintained by someone whose public face gives absolutely nothing away. Worth remembering too is the strange, almost comedic frame the wider story places around this discovery. The theft of Amantius's diary is staged as a kind of contest. 3 hopeful recruits, Amantius's own would-be burglars, all racing against one another to be the first to reach his house and make off with the book, egged on by a Thieves' Guild doyen named Armand Christophe, who arranges the whole competition from a garden in the Imperial City's waterfront district at the stroke of midnight. None of the 3 thieves involved know, walking in, what the diary actually contains. They're told only that it belongs to a writer somewhere in the city, that the local beggars can point the way for a price, and that whoever returns with it first earns a place in the guild. It's a fitting irony that an organization built around larceny and deception ends up being the one institution in the Imperial City that stumbles into genuine horror purely by accident, treating a man's darkest secret as nothing more than a convenient training exercise. There's also a small, almost darkly funny footnote worth including here. If the diary theft succeeds without anyone actually harming Amantius, a strange rumor starts circulating afterward among the city's residents, claiming he was murdered in a burglary and his house ransacked, even though he's still very much alive and still very much wandering his usual route to the main ingredient each afternoon. Whatever the origin of that particular whisper, it says something fitting about a man whose entire existence seems built around half-truths and misunderstandings. A life so quiet and so easily overlooked that even his own neighbors can't quite keep straight whether he's alive, dead, or simply going about business. Nobody has bothered to check on closely enough to know for certain. The Guildmaster's forbidden rites. Walk into the Cheydinhal chapter of the Mage's Guild, and the first thing you're likely to notice about its head is not warmth. Falcar, a high elf who runs the place with an iron discipline, has a reputation that precedes him through the whole city. Ordinary citizens of Cheydinhal talk about him the way you'd talk about a strict school teacher you're relieved not to have. Some say his intimidating presence has actually scared off potential recruits before they ever set foot through the guild hall doors, citizens admitting outright that they'd considered joining until they got a look at the man supposedly leading the chapter. Fellow guild members mutter that he keeps a tight rein on everything, that he seems perpetually irritated, that people go out of their way to avoid crossing his path unnecessarily. Even before the truth comes out, the general mood of the guild hall carries a kind of tension you wouldn't expect from an organization devoted to scholarship and magical study. None of that, on its own, makes him unusual. Plenty of guild leaders across Tamriel run tight ships and earn no love for it. What makes Falcar different is what he does behind a locked door in the guild hall's basement, where he retreats to sleep each night between 10 in the evening and 6 in the morning, and where he spends a significant part of every afternoon in near total isolation, unreachable, uninterested in explaining what exactly demands so much private attention. The truth surfaces slowly, and only if you're paying close attention. It begins with a routine assignment, the kind of recommendation quest every aspiring Mage's Guild member has to complete before advancing through the ranks. Somewhere in the course of investigating what should be an ordinary task, evidence starts pointing towards something Hannibal Traven the Guild's Archmage, has explicitly forbidden across every chapter under his authority. Necromancy, not dabbling in theory, not academic curiosity about the darker schools of magic, the kind plenty of scholars indulge from a safe intellectual distance. Active practice, conducted by the very man entrusted with upholding the Guild's rules in Cheydinhal. The same man citizens describe as intimidating, without ever suspecting quite how deserved that reputation might actually be. When the truth becomes undeniable, when a ring connected to a missing apprentice is finally recovered, and that apprentice, a man named Vidkun, turns up dead as a result of whatever Falka had been doing to him, Falka doesn't stay to explain himself or beg for leniency. He runs. He abandons the position he's held, renounces the guild he supposedly devoted his career to, and does the one thing that confirms every suspicion beyond any reasonable doubt. He joins the very network of necromancers his forbidden practice had connected him to all along. Word travels fast after that. Guild members in Cheydinhal, once so careful about how they discussed their intimidating leader, now trade a very different kind of gossip. Someone mentions that Falka has left the guild entirely, that he simply vanished one day without a word of explanation. Someone else notes, almost with relief, that a mage named Dietzen seems to be running things now, and that the atmosphere in the guild hall has already begun to lighten now that the man who once kept everyone so on edge is finally gone. But leaving doesn't mean disappearing, and that's where the story sharpens from a simple case of exposed corruption into something closer to a manhunt. Falka resurfaces at the ruins of Cylon, southwest of the Imperial City and just southeast of Skingrad, where a group of battle mages have been trying and failing to storm a sealed door, hiding a den of necromancers inside. The soldiers can't get through the magical barrier on their own, so they wait, watching for the necromancers to eventually come out on their own terms. When the group finally does emerge to confront the surrounding forces, Falka is among them, no longer disguised as a respected guild official, now openly aligned with the practitioners of the very magic he once punished others for even discussing within his own guild hall. The confrontation that follows is chaotic and telling in its own right. Falka doesn't fight alongside his fellow necromancers when the ambush closes in around them. The moment things turn against him, he bolts, sprinting back toward the ruins rather than standing his ground, prioritizing his own survival and whatever he's carrying over any loyalty to the necromancers he's fled alongside. It's a small, ugly detail that says a great deal about the man beneath the discipline he once projected. When the moment finally arrived to prove any kind of conviction, any kind of loyalty to the darker path he'd chosen, he simply ran. What he's carrying turns out to matter a great deal to that decision. A colossal black soul gem, an object of real and rare power, the kind of prize that explains why he abandoned a respected position for a life on the run in the first place. This wasn't a man who stumbled into forbidden practices by accident, seduced gradually by curiosity he couldn't control. This was a calculated pursuit of something he valued enough to burn his entire former life down for, something valuable enough that even mid-flight, mid-ambush, with allies dying around him, keeping hold of it mattered more than fighting. If you manage to run him down before he escapes back into the ruins, that pursuit ends there, in a chase through crumbling stone corridors that couldn't be further from the disciplined, buttoned-up guild hall he used to preside over. The soul gem can be recovered from his body and returned to Hannibal Traven, closing the loop on a scandal that started with a strict, unpopular administrator and ended with a fugitive necromancer dying in flight, clutching an artifact he'd apparently decided was worth more than his own reputation, his own guild, and ultimately, his own life. What's easy to miss in all this is how ordinary the warning signs looked while they were happening. A guild leader who keeps to himself, a locked basement room, a short temper that discourages anyone from asking too many questions. None of it screams forbidden magic on its own. All of it, taken together after the fact, reads like a portrait of someone who'd spent a long time building walls specifically so nobody would look too closely at what was happening behind them. The people of Cheydinhal thought they knew exactly what kind of man ran their guild hall. Strict, humorless, effective. It never occurred to them that the discipline he demanded of everyone else existed, in part, to keep them from noticing what he refused to discipline in himself, and that the very intimidation that kept curious recruits away from his door was likely never an accident at all, but a deliberate wall built to protect exactly the kind of secret it eventually failed to hide. Think too about Vidkun, the apprentice whose disappearance eventually cracks the whole facade open. He was, by every indication, exactly the kind of young mage a guild hall like Cheydinhal's was supposed to nurture and protect, someone who trusted the very man responsible for his education, enough to end up alone with him under circumstances that ultimately cost him his life. There's a particular cruelty in that betrayal that the rest of Falcar's story sometimes overshadows. A guildmaster's authority exists specifically because students are supposed to be safe placing their trust in it, and Falcar spent however long running his chapter, quietly proving that trust could be weaponized just as easily as it could be honored. One interpretation, based on how carefully hidden his practices remained, until that single loose thread finally unraveled everything, is that Vidkun wasn't his first quiet victim, only the first one whose absence became impossible to explain away. It's also worth noting how little ceremony surrounds his eventual fall. There's no dramatic unmasking in a crowded guild hall, no public trial, no moment where Hannibal Traven himself confronts his corrupted subordinate face to face. Falcar simply flees the instant the evidence becomes undeniable, and the guild absorbs the loss the way institutions often do, quietly, efficiently, promoting Dietzen into the vacancy and letting the scandal fade into the kind of hushed rumor that gets repeated at dinner tables for a few months before eventually stopping altogether. Cheydinhal's Mages Guild chapter, by every outward appearance, returned to normal almost immediately. Only the necromancer cult skulking through the ruins at Cylon and the soul gem eventually recovered from a dead man's body ever proved that anything had truly been wrong at all. The ambush that finally catches up to Falcar is worth lingering on a little longer, because it reveals just how far his fall had actually carried him by that point. 3 battle mages, Ivor, Merite, and a leader named Thalfin, have been waiting outside the sealed ruins at Cylon for the necromancers to emerge on their own terms, unable to force their way through the magical barrier sealing the door. When Falcar and his new allies finally do step outside, it isn't a small operation. He's flanked by 3 practicing necromancers, a small, organized cell that had clearly been operating out of those ruins for some time, refining whatever dark research they were pursuing together in a location remote enough that soldiers had to lay in wait for days just to catch them in the open. Whatever guild discipline Falcar once enforced in Cheydinhal, whatever intimidating authority he once wielded over nervous recruits, none of it prepared him for standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had built their entire lives around the very practice he'd once punished others for even discussing. It's also worth noting who inherits his old position once he's gone. Dietzen, mentioned only briefly by relieved guild members once Falcar's disappearance becomes common knowledge, steps into the vacancy with none of the fear or tension her predecessor cultivated. The guild hall, by every account, becomes an easier place to walk into as a stranger almost overnight, the kind of quiet, unremarked transition that makes you wonder how many other guild halls across the province might be sitting. Right now, under leadership, nobody has any reason yet to suspect. Worth noting too is how the very same standing that let Falcar hide his practice for so long is what made his eventual exposure so complete once it finally happened. Guildmasters carry real authority within the Mage's Guild structure, access to restricted areas, trust from the Archmage's own inner circle, freedom from the kind of casual oversight a junior member might expect. Falcar spent that authority not on protecting his chapter, but on shielding a practice the guild had explicitly outlawed. And once the truth finally surfaced, that same authority meant there was no quiet reprimand available to him, no lesser punishment a lower-ranking mage might have received. Flight was the only option left to a man who had climbed too high inside an institution to survive being caught, breaking its most fundamental rule. The mage who erased a village, north of the Imperial City, sits Fort Caractacus, a ruin that, for most of the game, doesn't seem to house anyone at all. That absence is itself the first clue, though almost nobody realizes it in time to interpret it correctly. A high elf warlock named Ankatar lives there, a wizard within the ranks of the Mage's Guild, and for a long stretch of the story, he simply doesn't appear. Not hidden behind a locked door, not sleeping somewhere off the beaten path, waiting to be discovered by a patient enough traveler. Genuinely, mechanically absent from the world, as though the game itself has forgotten to render him. A fort that appears from the outside to have been abandoned entirely. The reason becomes clear only once you're deep enough into the investigation to actually reach him. And even then, the explanation arrives with a kind of grim humor attached. Ankatar's recent magical research produced a side effect nobody, least of all Ankatar himself, seems to have anticipated. It rendered every living creature within a wide radius of his fort completely invisible. Not selectively invisible. Not invisible to enemies while visible to allies. The kind of tactical spell a battle-hardened conjurer might design on purpose. Simply, totally unseen, himself included, as if his own experiment had erased its creator along with everything else nearby. An effect so total and so uncontrolled that it reads less like a spell and more like a contagion. The consequences of that miscalculation didn't stay contained to his personal laboratory. Alswell, a small settlement close enough to the fort to fall within his spell's reach, found itself caught in the fallout. It's worth sitting with what that actually means for the people who live there. Ordinary villagers, farmers, and tradesfolk with no connection to arcane research whatsoever, suddenly unable to see their neighbors, their families, possibly even themselves, because a reclusive scholar a short distance away had been chasing some private magical ambition without any apparent concern for who might be standing inside its blast radius. Imagine for a moment waking in your own home to find the person beside you simply gone from sight, still speaking, still moving, still there in every sense, but the one that matters most for reassurance. That's the reality Ankatar's curiosity imposed on an entire village that never consented to being part of his experiment. When you finally do reach Fort Caractacus and approach it directly, Ankatar breaks his silence, quite literally confronting you the moment you draw near, snapping out something like a demand to know what you want from him, his voice carrying the particular irritation of a man who who has clearly grown used to being alone and resents any interruption to it. There's no warmth in the introduction, no apology built into his tone, just irritation that his isolation has been disturbed by whatever business has finally driven someone to his door. And when pressed about what exactly he's been doing out here alone, he doesn't deny it or dodge the question the way a guilty man might. He explains his experiments with something closer to pride than shame, laying out his research as though it were an achievement rather than a catastrophe that had swallowed an entire village's ability to see one another. There's a particular kind of arrogance in that reaction worth sitting with. This wasn't a man horrified by what he'd unleashed, scrambling to undo the damage before it spread further, racked with guilt over strangers he'd never intended to harm. This was someone who, even confronted directly with evidence of what his work had cost innocent people nearby, still seemed more invested in defending the experiment itself than in reckoning with its consequences. Whatever drove him to attempt this kind of invisibility research in the first place, it clearly outweighed, in his own mind, any responsibility toward the people who happened to live close enough to be caught in it. Based on what we know of his manner during that confrontation, this could imply a man who genuinely believed his research was important enough to justify whatever collateral cost it produced, a conviction more chilling in its quiet confidence than any outright villainy would have been. What happens to him afterward only deepens the strangeness. Even once the immediate crisis with Alswell is resolved, Ankata doesn't return to any semblance of a normal life. He starts wandering the exterior of the fort, permanently, restlessly, never eating, never sleeping despite a bedroll sitting unused nearby, as though something about the whole ordeal left him unable to settle back into an ordinary existence, unable to return to whatever passed for a routine before his experiment consumed everything else. He carries a magical ring, a leveled staff, an assortment of potions and scrolls, the tools of someone still very much practicing, still very much a warlock rather than a reformed hermit, chastened into abandoning his craft. And because his existence is no longer protected the way it was during the investigation into his experiments, the wildlife roaming outside the fort poses an ongoing threat to him, a small, almost karmic detail. The man who made an entire village invisible now wanders exposed, unshielded, in the open air he once used his magic to hide within. It's tempting to read Ankata as a bumbling scholar whose good intentions went sideways, the kind of tragic accident that could happen to anyone chasing knowledge a little too eagerly. Someone deserving more pity than judgment, but there's a colder read available too, one supported by his own unapologetic explanation of what he did. This could imply a man who understood exactly what kind of power he was reaching for and simply didn't weigh the cost to Alswell's ordinary residents as heavily as he weighed his own curiosity, treating an entire community's sudden blindness as an acceptable price for whatever knowledge he stood to gain. Either way, the fort north of the Imperial City stands as a reminder that not every hidden life in Cyrodiil involves murder or deception in the traditional sense. Sometimes the darkness is simpler than that. A man so consumed by what he wanted to discover that an entire village's sense of sight became, to him, an acceptable casualty of pure, unchecked curiosity. Picture what daily life must have looked like inside Alswell during whatever stretch of time the curse held. Neighbours calling out to one another across empty air. Doors opening and closing on their own as far as anyone standing nearby could tell. Every reassurance a person might normally take for granted. the simple certainty of seeing another living face and knowing you weren't alone, stripped away by a spell cast without their knowledge or consent, somewhere in a fort they'd likely passed 100 times without a second thought. It's easy, at a comfortable narrative distance, to treat Ankatar's story as almost whimsical, a wizard who got in over his head and paid for it with permanent isolation. It's harder to sit with what that same whimsy cost the ordinary people caught in its blast radius. People who never asked to be part of anyone's research and never received so much as an apology once the ordeal finally ended. There's a particular kind of loneliness too, in how his story resolves. Ankatar doesn't get punished in any formal sense, doesn't answer to the Mage's Guild for whatever rules he may have broken in pursuing forbidden or reckless experimentation. He simply continues existing at the edge of Fort Caractacus, permanently unessential now, permanently exposed to whatever predator happens to wander close enough to find him. It's less a resolution than a slow fade, a man left alone with whatever remains of his research and whatever guilt, if any, he ever actually allowed himself to feel. Whether he ever attempted to reverse what he'd done to Aliswell, whether he even fully understood the scope of the harm his curiosity had caused, remains as unclear as everything else about a man who spent so long simply not being there at all. Consider too the sheer strangeness of what it must have taken to even locate him in the first place. For a wide stretch of the game, no dialogue option, no rumor, no beggar's whisper points toward Fort Caractacus as anything other than an empty, unremarkable ruin sitting quietly north of the Imperial City, the kind of location a traveler might pass a dozen times, assuming it holds nothing but old stone and scattered loot. It's only through the specific chain of a Mage's Guild investigation, someone finally connecting Alswell's affliction back to its source, that Ankatar's existence becomes known at all. Before that connection is made, he isn't merely hiding. He is, for all practical purposes, erased from the world entirely, a side effect of his own spell so total that even the game's own systems treat him as though he doesn't exist until the exact moment the story requires him to. There's a bitter symmetry too, in how he greets the very people who eventually track him down. Rather than relief at finally having human contact again after however long he spent alone with his research, rather than any flicker of guilt at the damage his experiments have caused a village full of people who never volunteered for any of it. His first words carry only irritation at being disturbed. It's the reaction of a man who has spent his isolation nursing his research, rather than his conscience, someone whose invisibility, in the end, feels less like an accident he regrets and more like a solitude he'd almost grown comfortable inside. There's a small mercy worth naming in how this particular story likely resolves compared to some of the others tonight. Based on how the wider investigation into Ankatar is framed, and how quests of this shape typically conclude in Cyrodiil, we can reasonably assume Alswell's affliction lifts once its source is finally confronted, a reversal none of Amantius Electus's victims or Countess Caro's prisoners ever get to experience. If that assumption holds, it separates Ankatar's carelessness from something closer to true malice, a man whose arrogance caused genuine suffering, but whose research, whatever else it says about his priorities, still left the door open for that suffering to eventually end. Whether that makes his story less dark than the others, or simply dark in a different, more forgivable register, is worth sitting with on your own, long after the fort itself fades from view. The Collector's Hidden Crown. In the Talos Plaza district of the Imperial City stands a manor belonging to a wealthy high elf named Umbacano, and everything about the man at first reads as a refined eccentricity rather than anything sinister. He's an avid collector of Ayleid artifacts, the kind of enthusiast who'll pay generously for statues, panels, crowns, anything connected to the ancient elven civilization that once ruled this land long before the current empire existed. He keeps an extensive household of servants, including 4 guards stationed around his property, and a steward named Yollering, who manages the day-to-day running of his home with quiet efficiency. To reach Umbacano at all, you first have to be escorted through his own house by his own staff, a small ritual of formality that suggests a man who values his privacy and his position in equal measure, a man who has arranged his household specifically so that access to him is a controlled, deliberate thing rather than an open door. His fascination with the Ayleids goes beyond simple appreciation for old artwork though, and this is where the picture starts to shift. Umbacano doesn't merely admire the vanished elven empire the way a historian might admire a fallen civilization from a comfortable, academic distance. He defends it. He's something of an apologist for the Ayleids specifically, holding what amounts to a sympathetic view of their downfall, referring to the human uprising that ended their dominance over the imperial city as nothing more than a brutal sack rather than a liberation. It's a small linguistic choice, but it tells you where his sympathies genuinely lie. And it's not with the ancestors of the people currently living in Cyrodiil, the people whose ancestors, in his own framing, committed an atrocity rather than achieved a freedom. The relationship starts simply enough. He commissions you to track down statues connected to the old temple of the ancestors, offering fair payment for each one recovered from ruins scattered across the province, 10 in total, each one hidden within a different Ayleid settlement. Then it deepens. A carved panel from a place called Malada needs retrieving, a piece of the puzzle he seems to already know exactly where to point you toward, as though his research into these ruins has gone far beyond casual academic interest. Then it deepens further still, into a competition over a specific Ayleid crown currently owned by a rival collector named Herminia Sinner, someone who, notably, refuses outright to hand the item over to Umbacano, no matter what price he offers, even when he sends you to negotiate on his behalf with a purse of 1,000 gold pieces. When you eventually track her down yourself, she tells you something that should have been a warning from the very start. This particular crown carries genuine, magical significance beyond simple ornamentation, and in the wrong hands, that significance could prove dangerous, a warning specific enough that she'd rather part with the crown to a stranger than see it fall into Umbacano's own possession. She's not being paranoid. By the time you piece together what Umbacano actually intends to do with the artifacts he's spent so much time and gold accumulating, the shape of his ambition becomes impossible to mistake for harmless collecting. This isn't a man interested in displaying beautiful, ancient relics behind glass in his manor for the admiration of dinner guests, based on what unfolds once you finally deliver the correct crown to him. Umbacano intends to use it, to wield whatever residual power the Ayleids left behind, in pursuit of something considerably larger than personal enrichment. One interpretation, shared by more than a few, who've puzzled over exactly what he hoped to accomplish, is that he genuinely believed he could restore some fragment of Ayleid authority to the world, positioning himself at the center of a revival that hadn't been attempted in centuries. The final act of this relationship takes place at Nenalata, an Ayleid ruin where Umbacano asks you to serve as his bodyguard while he pursues the last piece of whatever plan he's been quietly assembling this entire time, escorted by his own manservant Claude Murrick as well. it's worth noting how much trust that request implies. This is a man who has, by this point, spent considerable time and resources cultivating you as a reliable agent, someone willing to break into rival collectors' homes and steal ancient property on his behalf without question. He believes, evidently, that this relationship has earned him your continued cooperation right up to the moment his true ambitions come to a head, that a wealthy patron's gold buys not just service, but genuine loyalty. What happens inside those ruins depends heavily on choices made earlier, but the confrontation itself reveals everything the polite manor visits and careful commissions had been quietly building toward. Umbacano, once he believes himself close enough to claiming genuine Ayleid power, turns hostile, summoning creatures against the very person he'd relied on to get him this far. The mask of the cultured, generous patron falling away entirely the instant he believes his goal is finally within reach. There's something almost pitiable in how the ambition curdles in real time. A wealthy, cultured man who spent years indulging what looked like harmless academic obsessions suddenly revealed as someone willing to fight, possibly to the death, over the fantasy of reviving an empire that fell so many centuries ago. It exists now only in ruins and crumbling inscriptions scattered across a province that has long since moved on. It raises an uncomfortable question that the game never answers directly. How much of Umbacano's collecting, from the very first statue he purchased, was ever truly about appreciation for the past? And how much was always aimed at this moment, and accumulating enough fragments of Ayleid power to finally attempt something with them? Based on what we know of his dialogue throughout the earlier quests, the apologist's sympathies, the careful accumulation, the answer seems to lean toward the latter. He wasn't a collector who stumbled into dangerous ambitions somewhere along the way, seduced by opportunity he hadn't originally sought. He was, quite possibly, a man with dangerous ambition who used collecting as the patient, respectable cover it needed to succeed, years of careful acquisition disguising a goal he'd likely held from the very beginning. Think about the sheer patience that plan required, if that reading holds. 10 separate statues, scattered across 10 different ruins throughout the province, each one requiring a treasure hunter willing to brave collapsing corridors and undead guardians on his behalf. A carved panel from Malada. 2 competing crowns. One obtained through outright theft from a rival collector who clearly understood, better than anyone else in this story, exactly what kind of danger she was protecting the world from by refusing to sell. None of this reads like the collecting habits of a man simply passing time with an expensive hobby. It reads like the methodical assembly of components toward a single, carefully guarded goal, executed with enough patience and enough plausible academic cover that nobody, not even the treasure hunter doing all the actual legwork, thought to question where it was all heading until the very last piece slotted into place. There's also something worth noting in how ordinary Umbacano's manner feels right up until the moment it doesn't. Servants greeting you politely at the door, a steward escorting you upstairs with practiced formality, a wealthy patron sitting in his chair reading exactly as he does every day from 8 in the morning until 8 at night. An unbroken routine of quiet scholarly leisure that gives no outward hint of the ambition simmering underneath. It's the same trick so many of these stories share. The appearance of a settled, predictable life functioning as the perfect camouflage for something considerably less settled, hiding just beneath it, waiting patiently for the one piece still missing to finally arrive. There's a telling detail buried in how Umbacano frames his own request throughout the earlier stages of this relationship. One easy to dismiss as flavor text at the time, but considerably harder to dismiss once his true ambitions surface. He never simply asks for artifacts because they're beautiful or historically significant. He speaks about the Aelids the way a devoted believer speaks about a faith, rather than the way a scholar speaks about a subject of study, treating their fall from power less as ancient history and more as an ongoing injustice still waiting, in some sense, to be corrected. When Herminia Cinna refuses to sell him the crown outright, it isn't simple stubbornness or a rival collector's jealousy driving that decision. She's read the same research he has, followed the same threads, and arrived at a very different conclusion about what letting a man like Umbacano hold that kind of power might actually mean for anyone standing near him when he finally tries to use it. Even the final journey to Nenalata carries this same quiet doubling. Umbacano brings along his own manservant, Claude Marik, treating the whole expedition with the formal seriousness of a man attending his own coronation, rather than a simple archaeological retrieval. Tucked away in the game's own unused dialogue, never actually spoken aloud in a playthrough but preserved in its files all the same, is a line where Umbacano asks whether you'll be able to remain professional once you arrive at Nenalata. A strange thing for a wealthy patron to have ever considered asking his bodyguard unless, on some level, even in early planning, there was already an expectation that professionalism might be tested. Cut content like this can't be taken as confirmed canon, since the player never actually hears it, but it fits, at the very least, the shape of a man who seems to have understood, even as he prepared for that day, that it might not end the way his years of careful, patient collecting were always meant to. It's worth remembering, finally, that Umbacano never once has to lie outright to get what he wants throughout most of this story. Every request he makes is, on its own, entirely reasonable for a wealthy collector to ask of someone he's paying well. Retrieve a statue, recover a panel, negotiate for a crown. None of it requires deception, because none of it, taken individually, reveals anything about where the pattern is ultimately heading. That's precisely what makes him different from someone like Reynald Dralis, whose entire scheme depended on active, deliberate lies told to specific people. Umbacano's danger was never hidden behind falsehood. It was hidden behind the simple, ordinary truth of what a wealthy man's hobby looks like from the outside, a truth nobody thought to question until the pieces he'd been quietly gathering finally added up to something worth fearing. The list of death. Skingrad has its share of memorable residents, but few leave quite as immediate an impression as Glarthir, a wood elf commoner whose very first interaction with most travellers involves a strange, urgent request to meet him behind the great chapel of Julianos at midnight. It's an odd opening move for someone claiming to just want a conversation, and it sets the tone for everything that follows, right from the moment he first tracks you down near the city's western gate. Ask around town about him beforehand, and the picture painted is almost affectionately dismissive. He's the local eccentric, people will tell you. Harmless. The kind of person a city just learns to tolerate. The sort of quirk you get used to, the way you get used to a strange smell that's always been there. But there's a second layer beneath that casual reassurance. One that surfaces if you happen to linger in Skingrad long enough after asking those questions. The commander of the city guard himself, a man named Dion, will seek you out, not with the mild concern you'd expect over a mere town character, but with an edge of real warning in his voice, urging you to stay away from Glarthir and to notify the guards immediately if he ever asks you to do anything strange. It's a strange thing for a guard captain to volunteer unprompted, and it tells you, before you've even met the man himself, that whatever's beneath Glarthir's reputation has already caught official attention. That warning turns out to be entirely justified. Once the midnight meeting happens, Glarthir explains himself with the total, unshakable conviction of someone who has spent a very long time turning something over in his mind. He believes there is a conspiracy against him, orchestrated by people living on his own street, watching his every move, reporting on him to some unnamed authority he never quite manages to name specifically. He names names. Bernadette Penelles, his neighbor directly across the street, who he watches for from the chapel steps each morning at 5, hoping to catch a glimpse of her leaving for prayer. Tutius Sextius, whom he tracks from a distance near the east gate. David Surilli, a vineyard worker whose comings and goings around noon. Glarthir has apparently studied closely enough to know exactly when to expect him home for lunch. He asks you to follow each of them in turn, to catch them in the act of surveillance, to bring back proof one way or the other. What makes this section of the story genuinely unsettling is how mundane the surveillance targets turn out to be. Follow Bernadette, and you'll find her doing nothing more sinister than tending her garden and attending morning prayers, living precisely the quiet life her routine suggests. Follow Tutius, and the most suspicious thing you might witness is an unrelated pickpocketing incident happening near him, easily misread as something more significant if you're already primed to see conspiracy everywhere. A stranger brushing past him for entirely unconnected reasons. Every single person on Glarthir's list is, by any reasonable measure, simply living an ordinary life. The conspiracy exists nowhere but inside his own conviction, and yet that conviction is powerful enough that he's willing to act on it regardless of what evidence you actually bring back to him. That's when the true weight of what he's asking becomes clear. Whether you report his neighbors as innocent or guilty barely matters in the end, because eventually Glarthir stops asking you to merely watch and starts asking you to kill. He'll pay you, handsomely, 1,000 gold in total, to murder the very people he's convinced himself are spying on him, framing the whole request as a simple transactional job rather than what it actually is, a demand that you help him commit premeditated murder against people who've done nothing wrong, beyond living near a man whose paranoia has curdled into something homicidal. If you refuse to take part, Glarthir doesn't simply let the matter drop. He'll attempt the killings himself, retrieving a weapon from his own home and marching toward his intended target's house with lethal intent, regardless of whether you've agreed to help him or not. This isn't a fantasy he's content to leave unfulfilled once denied a willing accomplice. Left unchecked, his paranoia translates directly into violence, one way or another, with or without your cooperation. Whether that violence ends with him standing over a body or dying himself at the hands of the city guard, he's finally provoked into stopping him. There's a physical document that confirms just how methodically he'd planned this entire scheme. A written list, sometimes called his death list, naming the very people he once killed. Plainly enough, that showing it to a city guard or to one of the intended targets is, on its own, sufficient evidence to have him stopped. It's the paperwork of someone who has fully reframed murder as an administrative task, a job to be tracked and completed, rather than the moral catastrophe it actually represents. That same house, once you finally have reason to search it, holds a modest stash of gold tucked inside a wastebasket by the door, alongside an inkwell, the mundane clutter of an ordinary life sitting alongside evidence of exactly how far that ordinary life had quietly curdled behind closed doors. What's perhaps most disquieting is how the town itself responds. Skingrad's guards know something is wrong with Glarthir. The captain personally warns strangers away from him, and yet nothing is done to stop him before he acts. Nothing prevents him from approaching newcomer after newcomer with the same midnight proposal, hoping eventually to find someone willing to carry out what he can't quite bring himself to finish cleanly on his own. He is, by every account given before you ever meet him, simply the town eccentric. It's only in the privacy of that midnight meeting behind the chapel that the truth surfaces. Beneath the eccentricity sits a man entirely willing to pay for the deaths of innocent neighbors, convinced beyond any reasoning that his paranoid fantasy is in fact the only truth that matters, and willing to keep asking every stranger who passes through the city until, eventually, someone says yes. There's a quiet tragedy folded into Bernadette Penelle specifically, worth pausing on for a moment. Raise her disposition high enough, and rather than confirming or denying Glarthir's accusations, she'll admit something that reframes the entire situation in a way Glarthir himself never seems to grasp. She watches him sometimes, not because she's spying on him for some imagined authority, but because she thinks he's rather sweet. A fondness that exists in the same house across the street he's convinced is a surveillance post. It's a small, sad irony sitting at the center of the whole affair. The one genuine feeling directed at Glarthir from anyone on his list isn't hostility or conspiracy at all. It's a quiet, unrequited affection he's twisted, through the lens of his own unraveling mind, into something sinister enough to justify murder. Consider, too, how differently this story might read if Glarthir had simply been left alone somewhere private with his delusions, never given a stranger willing to indulge his midnight requests. His paranoia doesn't require an outside accomplice to become dangerous. Left to his own devices, he'll grab a weapon and march on his target regardless. What a traveler willing to play along actually provides isn't the capacity for violence, which was always going to be there one way or another. What they provide is efficiency, reconnaissance, a second pair of eyes that can confirm his suspicions are baseless, and yet still, somehow, walk away, having taken his gold and left his neighbors to face him alone. It's worth dwelling, briefly, on what it must be like to live across the street from a man like Glarthir, without ever knowing the full shape of what churns behind his eyes. Bernadette wakes each morning, tends her garden, walks to chapel, entirely unaware that the neighbor she's fond enough of to occasionally watch from her window has, on more than one occasion, stood outside the great chapel of Julianos at midnight, negotiating the price of her own murder with a total stranger. Tutius Sextius crosses the Eastern Bridge each day, minding his own affairs, never once suspecting that his routine has been catalogued and reported on by someone he likely considers at most a mildly odd fixture of the neighborhood. David Surly tends his vineyard with no idea that his afternoons have been the subject of careful, obsessive study. Skingrad goes on exactly as it always has, its residents entirely unaware of how close their ordinary routines have come, more than once, to ending in violence over nothing at all. It's also worth noting the different paths available once Glarthir finally hands over his full request, because each one says something distinct about how a stranger might respond to a request this monstrous. Reporting him to the city guard, showing them the note he's written out plainly as a list of people to kill, is enough on its own to have them move against him. Warning either of the Cyrilli brothers directly, should Glarthir have named one of them as a target, produces much the same result. Ordinary townsfolk taking matters into their own hands against a neighbor who's finally revealed himself as a genuine danger. There's no path in this story where Glarthir's plan simply gets forgotten or quietly ignored. Someone, in every version of how this can end, has to actively decide that a paranoid man's gold isn't worth the lives it would cost. And Skingrad's own guards, once given the evidence in plain writing, prove considerably more decisive about it than they'd ever managed to be simply on the basis of rumour and suspicion alone. There's a final, quiet unease worth sitting with once Glarthir is finally dealt with, whatever path brought that ending about. His own house, once you have reason to search it, offers no dramatic confession, no manifesto explaining how a man arrives at believing his neighbours have organised a conspiracy against him. Just an ordinary home, gold tucked in a wastebasket, the same modest clutter you'd find in any commoner's dwelling in Skingrad. There's no answer waiting inside for why the paranoia took root in the first place. No earlier trauma named, no single triggering event a listener could point to and say, there, that's where it started. It simply exists, fully formed, in a man the rest of the city had already decided long ago wasn't worth taking seriously, right up until taking him seriously became a matter of life and death for 3 of his neighbours. The hunter, who was the predator, Bruma, cold and mountainous, isn't the kind of city that draws much excitement under ordinary circumstances, which makes the sudden arrival of a self-proclaimed vampire hunter something of a local sensation. His name is Raynald Dralus, a dark elf who wanders into town claiming a particular dangerous expertise, and word of his presence spreads through the taverns quickly. Someone overhears him bragging at Olaf's tap and tack about his exploits, telling anyone who'll listen that he's an honest-to-goodness vampire hunter, the real thing, not some charlatan looking for coin off frightened villagers. Someone else recalls that he'd apparently already dealt with a vampire in Skingrad before arriving here, a fact the city guard seems to trust readily enough to lend him real credibility. Word of his supposed accomplishment having reached Bruma's watch through official channels between the 2 cities. That credibility gets put to immediate use. Not long after his arrival, a local man named Braden Lyrian turns up dead in his own home, and Raynald is the one who supposedly uncovered the truth behind it. Braden, he claims, was secretly a vampire, responsible for a string of bodies found outside the city with telltale puncture wounds on their necks. Bodies belonging to beggars who wandered the streets looking for handouts, the kind of people a predator might assume nobody would miss too closely. The city guard, led by an investigator named Carius Runelius, accepts this account without much resistance. It fits the evidence, more or less. A murdered beggar's body was even found stashed in Braden's own basement, seemingly confirming the accusation beyond doubt. Discovered when Raynald entered the house around noon and found Braden asleep. Exactly the vulnerable daylight hours a vampire would need to hide in. Braden's widow, Erlene, refuses to accept it. She insists her husband simply worked nights and slept during the day, that there's a mundane explanation for his unusual hours, that the man she loved could not possibly have been the monster everyone now believes him to have been. Her grief reads, at first glance, like simple denial, the kind of desperate defense any spouse might offer, rather than accept an ugly truth about someone they loved. It takes real investigation to discover that her instincts were right all along, and that the actual monster in this story wasn't her husband at all, but the very man Bruma had welcomed as its savior. The unraveling begins at Olaf's Inn, where Raynald supposedly keeps a room, though he's conspicuously never actually found there when you go looking, always somewhere else, always unavailable. Searching that room, with a key provided by the innkeeper himself once his trust is earned, turns up something Raynald clearly never intended anyone to find. a journal tucked behind a small cupboard, out of sight, belonging not to him, but to a man named Geliborn. That journal tells a very different story than the one Bruma's guards have already accepted as fact. Braden, Raynell, and Geliborn, it turns out, were once part of the same group, treasure hunters who years ago looted an Ayleid ruin together and discovered a powerful amulet, the Phylactery of Litheness, and made a pact to hide it away until they better understood what it was capable of. Each of the three kept one of three keys needed to open the chest where it had been stashed, a shared secret meant to protect all of them equally. Once you know to ask about Geliborn specifically, Olaf confirms the final piece of the puzzle, almost casually, without realizing the weight of what he's revealing. Geliborn met the exact same fate as Braden, accused of vampirism and killed by the same self-proclaimed hunter in Skingrad, under circumstances that now look far less like justice and far more like a pattern repeating itself with practiced efficiency. Raynell hadn't stumbled onto two unrelated vampire cases in two different cities. He'd hunted down his own former companions, one by one, staging each death to look like the righteous work of a monster slayer rather than what it actually was. Cold, premeditated murder, motivated entirely by greed for a treasure the three of them had once agreed to share equally. The murdered beggar planted in Braden's basement makes grim sense in this light too. Raynell needed physical evidence to sell the vampire story convincingly to Bruma's guards, and an innocent, unconnected beggar's life became nothing more than a prop in that deception, discarded specifically to frame a man Raynell had already decided to kill for his key. A life spent as casually as a stage prop in service of a much larger lie. When the truth finally reaches Carius, the guard captain who trusted Raynell's account without much skepticism, the pursuit shifts entirely. Raynell flees Bruma, holing up in Boreal Stone Cave with a limited window before he manages to escape the province and vanish entirely with whatever share of the treasure he intends to keep for himself. The once celebrated hunter, now the hunted, tracked by the very guards who'd been ready to give him a hero's welcome only days before. Confronted there, he doesn't bother denying what he's done, offering instead a kind of weary acknowledgement that his stupidity in leaving the journal behind was what finally undid him. There's a certain grim satisfaction, based on his own words in that final confrontation, in how readily he seems to acknowledge his own cleverness up until that point, treating the whole scheme as something to be almost proud of rather than ashamed. What makes this story land harder than a simple murder mystery is how thoroughly Bruma's own institutions fail to catch it. A stranger arrives, claims an impressive and difficult to verify credential, produces one body after another framed as monstrous threats successfully neutralized, and an entire city's guard apparently never questions why a lone traveler happened to solve their vampire problem so conveniently, so quickly, so completely, twice over in two separate cities, without anyone connecting the pattern. It took a grieving widow's stubborn refusal to accept the official story, and one overlooked journal left carelessly behind, to finally expose that the hunter Bruma had welcomed with open arms had never been protecting anyone. He'd simply found a story that let him kill his old friends in broad daylight and be thanked for it. Sit for a moment with what it must have taken to plan something like this in the first place. Raynell didn't simply murder Braden and Geliborn in the dark and hope nobody asked questions. He built an entire persona around the killing beforehand, cultivating a reputation as a hunter of monsters specifically so that when the bodies started appearing, the story would already have somewhere safe to land. Word of his supposed success in Skingrad reached Bruma's guard before he ever arrived in person, which means he'd likely spent time in that first city making sure his cover story travelled ahead of him, planting the seeds of his own credibility with the same patience he'd once shown as a treasure hunter searching for lost Ayleid ruins. This wasn't a crime of impulse. It was a performance rehearsed once already in Skingrad and refined before its second staging in Bruma. And there's a bitter irony worth noting in how close he came to succeeding completely. Had Erlene Lyrian simply accepted the guard's explanation the way most grieving spouses might, exhausted and unwilling to fight a story the entire city had already agreed upon, Raynil would likely have vanished from Bruma within days, treasure in hand, remembered fondly as the hunter who'd rid the town of a dangerous predator. Instead, one widow's refusal to let her husband's memory be slandered turned out to be the only thing standing between Raynil and a clean escape, a reminder that sometimes the only real defense against a lie this well constructed is simply someone who refuses to stop asking questions everyone else has already decided are settled. There's something worth noting too about what the three men were originally guarding so carefully in that shared chest. The phylactery of litheness wasn't the kind of prize any of them could have simply split and walked away with individually. The whole arrangement, 3 keys held by 3 separate men, only worked as a system of mutual trust, a pact meaning none of them could claim the amulet alone without the other 2 agreeing. Raynil didn't just betray his friends for treasure. He dismantled, one murder at a time, the entire structure of trust the 3 of them had built specifically to prevent exactly this kind of betrayal from ever being possible. Whatever the amulet was ultimately worth, it clearly mattered enough to him that he was willing to become the sole exception to an agreement designed to have no exceptions at all. There's a final, uncomfortable question worth carrying away from Bruma once this story concludes. What happens to a city's judgment after something like this comes to light? Carius Runelius, the investigator who accepted Raynil's account so readily, who declared the case closed on the strength of one travelling stranger's word, has to live with having gotten it wrong in a way that cost an innocent man his life and his reputation both. Nothing in the aftermath suggests any real reckoning for that failure. No formal review of how a murderer walked freely through Bruma's streets on the guard's own trust. The city simply moves forward, the way cities in Cyrodiil so often do once a crisis resolves. Its watch presumably a little warier of confident strangers bearing convenient solutions, though warier in Cyrodiil rarely seems to last as long as it probably should. The Countess's hidden chamber. Leowyn sits at the edge of the Blackwood region, a city known for its unusually diverse population, home to significant numbers of Argonians and Khajiit who've lived there for generations alongside their imperial neighbours. That diversity, historically, was part of what defined the city's character, a melting pot in a way few other settlements in Cyrodiil could claim. It's also, under its current ruling couple, become the very thing they're determined to erase. Countess Alessia Caro arrived in Leowyn through marriage, the recent wife of Count Marius Caro, and the daughter of Coral's own countess, Ariana Valga. On the surface, everything about her radiates exactly the kind of poise expected of nobility. She's described by those who know her socially as renowned for her beauty, her wit, her grace, the union of Alessia and Marius spoken of in some circles as a perfect blend of love and wise political maneuvering. She keeps a devoted personal bodyguard. She's accompanied everywhere by a trusted advisor named Lidara Mothril, who watches over her schedule with meticulous care. She dutifully visits her mother in Coral every month, riding out on the 15th and returning by the 17th, a small ritual of family devotion that seems, at first glance, entirely in keeping with the image of a dedicated, dutiful noblewoman, balancing marriage and filial loyalty in equal measure. That image starts cracking the moment you actually speak with her. Alessia doesn't bother disguising her contempt for the beast races living under her rule. She's openly, unapologetically prejudiced against Argonians in particular, though her distaste extends to Khajiit and Dunmer as well, viewing anyone outside strict imperial culture with open disdain. It's the kind of prejudice that both pleases and disgusts the people around her in roughly equal measure, splitting the castle's staff and the wider city along lines that mirror exactly who benefits from her worldview and who suffers under it. She and her husband have set about implementing what amounts to a deliberate policy of cultural suppression against Leowin's historical Argonian and Khajiit minority, working to establish a blander, more thoroughly imperial-dominated identity for a city that had never before demanded such conformity from its people. What separates Alessia from simply being an unpleasant bigot in a position of power is what her prejudice actually translates into once you start pulling at the threads. It begins with a stolen ring, a job that sends you into Castle Leowin, chasing down a piece of jewelry an Argonian named Amusei took from a woman named Adaji. In the course of tracking that ring down, talking to prisoners, bribing guards, listening to beggars trade rumors around the city, a different kind of story starts surfacing, one that has nothing to do with theft. Beggars mention it first, cautiously, the way people talk about something they've heard but can't quite confirm. There's supposedly a hidden torture chamber somewhere inside Castle Leowin, they say, where Count Marius interrogates Argonian immigrants arriving from Black Marsh. The servants whisper that these Argonians get dragged down into the basement and are never seen again. It's the kind of rumor that could easily be dismissed as exaggerated fear, the sort of urban legend that grows up around any powerful, unpopular ruling family, embellished with each retelling until it barely resembles whatever truth first sparked it. Except it isn't exaggerated at all. Confirmation comes from someone with far more reason to know the truth than any beggar on the street. Lidara, Mothril, the Countess's own trusted advisor, will reveal the full picture if you manage to earn enough of her confidence, and what she describes is considerably worse than what the rumors alone suggested. This isn't the Count acting alone. Some private cruelty his wife remains innocent of, a burden he carries without her knowledge. According to Lidara, there's a secret passage connecting a torture room to the Countess's own private quarters, and both husband and wife make a point of participating together. Lidara has heard the screams from her own bedroom, close enough that she can't pretend not to know exactly what's happening beneath the castle floors on any given night. A horror she's apparently learned to live alongside as a condition of her own service. Finding the chamber yourself only confirms the horror in physical terms, accessible through a lever hidden inside an open barrel in the castle basement. It's a sizable room containing a bloodied table at its center and an assortment of implements meant for exactly the purpose the rumors described. Small knives among them, tools chosen with deliberate intent rather than improvised in a moment of anger. This isn't a repurposed storage room or an overreaction to a single interrogation. It has the deliberate, purpose-built quality of a space maintained for regular, sustained use, connected directly onward to the Countess's own bedroom, so close to where she sleeps each night that the two spaces might as well share a single wall. What's perhaps most unsettling is how completely this coexists with the rest of Alessia's public life. She still makes her dutiful monthly trip to visit her mother. She still hosts elegant dinner parties for a small circle of favoured guests, still sits gracefully on her throne receiving petitioners, still carries herself with exactly the refined bearing everyone in Leyawiin expects of their Countess. The torture chamber doesn't replace that public persona. It simply exists alongside it, hidden behind a lever in a barrel, a secret passage away from her own bed, close enough that her most trusted advisor can hear it happening, and far enough that ordinary citizens can go on believing the rumours are just rumours, comfortable fictions that let them continue admiring a woman whose grace, it turns out, was never the whole story. It raises a question that Leyawiin's own divided population seems to have already answered for themselves, long before any outsider arrives to investigate. Some of the city's residents support the Karos' vision of a more imperialized Leyawiin, without reservation, comfortable with whatever cost that vision demands of their neighbors. Others, particularly among the Argonian and Khajiit communities, know exactly what that vision actually costs, because their own neighbors have vanished into that castle and never come back out. The Countess's grace and wit were never in question. What was hidden carefully behind a wall in her own basement was exactly how far she and her husband were willing to go to make Leyawiin look the way they wanted it to look. There's something particularly chilling in the domestic detail of it all, the way the horror is woven directly into the architecture of her own marriage, rather than kept at arm's length. So many stories of hidden cruelty involve some measure of distance. A villain who orders atrocities carried out by others while keeping his own hands clean. Alessia doesn't have that distance. The passage runs directly from the torture room to her private quarters, meaning every night she retires to bed, she does so within a few footsteps of the very chamber where she and her husband have spent the evening, by Hlidara's own account, actively participating together. It isn't a policy carried out on her behalf by nameless enforcers somewhere else in the city. It's a habit, intimate and deliberately close, folded into the same private wing of the castle where she sleeps, prays, and receives her jewelry each night before bed. It's also worth remembering that this entire revelation only surfaces because of a stolen ring, an object with no connection whatsoever to torture or prejudice, simply an Argonian thief's opportunistic theft from a noblewoman's jewelry box. Had Amusei never stolen that ring, had Adaji never hired someone to retrieve it, there's a real chance the chamber beneath Castle Leyawiin might have gone entirely undiscovered by any outsider. Its existence limited forever to rumour and to the servants too frightened of their own positions to ever speak the truth aloud where it might be believed. Sometimes the darkest secrets in Cyrodiil don't get uncovered through careful investigation aimed specifically at exposing them. Sometimes they simply happen to sit adjacent to an unrelated errand, waiting behind a lever in a barrel for anyone curious enough to pull it. Consider too the position Hlidara Mothril occupies in all of this, caught between genuine loyalty to the household she serves and a horror she can apparently no longer pretend not to hear from her own bedroom each night. She's not a conspirator in the torture itself, based on everything we know of her role in the castle, but she is undeniably someone who has made peace with proximity to it, who continues serving as the Countess's trusted advisor and confidant despite knowing exactly what happens behind that basement wall. That's its own quiet tragedy sitting alongside the larger one. An entire household of people, guards, servants, advisors, learning to live adjacent to something monstrous simply because their livelihoods, their positions, their futures all depend on staying close to the family responsible for it. It's worth remembering, finally, that Leowin's own layout seems almost designed to hide this kind of secret in plain sight. A castle built with hidden passages and false walls isn't unusual architecture for nobility anywhere in Cyrodiil, the kind of feature that could just as easily protect a family's valuables as it could conceal something considerably darker. The line between prudent security and active concealment turns out to be thinner than anyone in Leowin might like to admit, and Castle Leowin sits, even now, as a monument to exactly how easily that line can be crossed by people with enough power to make sure nobody asks too many questions about what their walls are really hiding. One last detail lingers, almost unbearably, once you piece the whole picture together. Alessia continues, throughout all of this, to host dinners at her own table with an Argonian couple from the city, a pair often referred to together by outsiders as though sharing a single household name. Guests she treats with at least the outward appearance of civility, despite everything else we now know about what happens elsewhere in her castle. Whether that arrangement reflects some genuine, narrow exception carved out of her broader prejudice, or whether it serves some quieter political purpose, a visible show of tolerance sitting deliberately atop a foundation of cruelty, remains one of the more unsettling ambiguities in her story, the kind of detail that resists any tidy explanation and simply sits there, unresolved, the way so much of Alessia Caro's life seems built to do. The knight who lied about glory. Cheydinhal has its own knightly order, or at least something that likes to call itself one. The Knights of the Thorn were founded a couple of years before the Oblivion crisis by Farwill Inderis, the son of Count Andal Inderis himself, and from the very beginning, the city's actual guards regarded the whole institution with something between amusement and irritation. Ask any of them about the Knights, and you'll hear roughly the same story. A glorified drinking club, a collection of Farwill's friends who make grand claims about battles and victories despite having accomplished, prior to the Oblivion crisis, essentially nothing of note beyond annoying the town guards and boasting in the local tavern. It's easy to dismiss Farwill as simply a spoiled noble's son, playing dress-up with a title, and for most of his existence in the world, that's exactly what he is. He wears steel armor, carries a shield bearing his order's crest, and speaks with the kind of theatrical bravado that suggests someone who has spent far more time imagining glorious battles than actually fighting in them. When you first hear about him, before you ever meet him directly, that reputation is already fully formed. A nuisance, tolerated because of his father's position, mocked behind his back by the very guards whose job it is to actually protect the city. One guardsman going so far as to note that Andal Indaris doesn't help his own reputation by having such a prat for a son. Then an Oblivion gate opens directly outside the Knights of the Thorn's own headquarters, and Farwill sees, in that sudden catastrophe, an opportunity rather than a threat. Here, finally, was a chance to prove to the skeptical City Watch that his order deserved to be taken seriously. A chance he'd apparently been waiting for since the day he founded the club in the first place. So he does what a leader convinced of his own destiny does. He leads his men straight into the gate, without pausing to request reinforcement from the actual trained soldiers of Cheydinhal's guard, without so much as a coordinated plan beyond, apparently, sheer confidence that bravery alone would carry them through whatever waited on the other side. It doesn't. The knights are overwhelmed almost immediately upon entering. Wave after wave of Daedric forces cut down member after member, until, by the time anyone realizes just how badly this has gone, only 2 of the 7 knights who entered remain alive at all. Farwell himself, and a soldier named Bremen Senyon, both wounded, both trapped deep inside a hostile realm, with no clear way back out. Days pass, with no word from any of them. Count Andal Indris, watching his own son go silent inside an active Oblivion gate, eventually posts a reward for anyone willing to go in after him, whether to bring him home or simply to confirm his death. A father forced into offering payment for news of his own child's fate. The rescue itself is where the gap between Farwell's version of events and the actual truth becomes impossible to ignore. Speak to Farwell once you find him, and he'll recount the ordeal with undiminished theatrical flair, insisting he personally killed perhaps 20 of the Daedra himself, framing the entire disaster as an ongoing heroic campaign rather than a catastrophic failure of leadership. He'll even, astonishingly, refuse rescue on principle at first, declaring that a true Knight of the Thorn never returns home until the mission is finished, ordering you, in his father's name as Count Indaris of Cheydinhal, to press forward and retrieve the sigil stone rather than simply leading his surviving men to safety, suggesting a Remen sweep formation as though this were a proper military engagement rather than the desperate remnant of a slaughter. It's Bremen, exhausted and clearly less invested in preserving anyone's legend, who tells you what actually happened, offering to share what he calls the real story rather than Farwell's version. Not long after the gate opened, Bremen explains, Farwell decided an assault was in order, and they charged in. 3 knights died in that very first clash. Rather than reconsidering, rather than retreating to gather support from the city guard whose help he'd refused to request in the first place, Farwell pressed forward again, at his own insistence, straight into a second and even larger wave of Daedric resistance at the base of a citadel deeper within the plain. 2 more knights died there. Farwell himself and Bremen were both badly wounded in that second engagement, and it was only then, cornered and bleeding, that retreat even started to seem like a reasonable option. An option that turned out to be unavailable anyway, since the path back had already been sealed off by more Daedra behind them. Bremen's own summary of the whole affair lands with a bluntness Farwell's own account entirely lacks. It was, in his own words, just like Farwell to leap before he looked. Had they simply brought a contingent of the City Watch along in the first place, exactly the kind of support Farwell refused to seek, because he wanted his order to prove itself independently, they might have retrieved the sigil stone with minimal losses. Instead, 5 people are dead, killed in service of Farwell's need to demonstrate that the Knights of the Thorn deserved a respect the City Watch had never been willing to give them. A respect purchased at a cost none of the other 5 knights ever agreed to pay knowingly. If you manage to bring both men out alive, Farwell's storytelling continues entirely uninterrupted by what actually happened. He'll reward you with a Fortify Speechcraft amulet, make you an honorary member of his order, and speak about the entire ordeal as though it unfolded exactly the way he'd already been describing it. Glory intact, leadership unquestioned. The Count himself, when you return with news of his son's survival, offers no apparent scrutiny of how 5 knights ended up dead accomplishing what a single properly coordinated rescue eventually managed on its own, instead rewarding you with a choice between 2 family heirlooms as thanks for bringing his son home. Cheydinhal's actual guards, who'd mocked the Knights of the Thorn as a glorified drinking club for years, now find themselves with fresh material, except this time the joke has a body count attached to it. One that Farwell's own retelling seems entirely uninterested in acknowledging, let alone atoning for. Spare a thought too for the 5 knights who never make it back out of that Oblivion gate at all. Men whose names rarely come up once the rescue is complete, whose bodies remain scattered through caverns and ledges deep inside a plain most of Cheydinhal will never set foot in themselves. They followed Farwell into that gate, presumably out of the same loyalty, the same belief in the Order's cause, that kept the Knights of the Thorn functioning as a social fixture in the first place, whatever its reputation among the actual Guard. Whatever camaraderie bound that group together before the gate opened, it wasn't enough to save 4 out of every 7 members who walked in beside their founder, and it certainly wasn't enough to earn them so much as individual acknowledgement once the survivors made it home. What makes this particular story sting in a quieter way than some of the others we've covered tonight is that Farwell's dishonesty isn't calculated the way Raynil Dralis's was, or cynical the way Ulrich Leland's extortion scheme was. Based on how thoroughly he seems to believe his own account, even while recounting it to the very people who rescued him, this could imply something closer to genuine self-deception than deliberate lying. A man so committed to seeing himself as the hero of his own story that the deaths of half his knights simply don't register as a failure worth reconsidering. Whether that makes him more forgivable or less is a question the game leaves entirely for the listener to decide. There's a quieter observation worth making about Count Andal Indris himself, a father who offers a reward for his son's rescue or confirmed death, who waits days without word, who must have understood, on some level, exactly what kind of leader his son had proven himself to be, well before that gate ever opened. Nothing in his reaction afterwards suggests he holds Farwell accountable for the losses. No restructuring of the Knights of the Thorn. No quiet word about seeking guidance from the City Watch going forward. If anything, the family's response mirrors Farwell's own selective memory, treating the ordeal as a survival story worth celebrating rather than a leadership failure worth examining. It leaves the Knights of the Thorn free to continue exactly as they were before, a glorified drinking club now dressed in the language of heroism. Waiting, perhaps, for the next opportunity, Farwell decides is worth 5 more lives to seize. There's a final, quieter irony worth sitting with before we leave Cheydinhal behind. If both men are brought home safely, Farwell and Bremen can be found afterward, simply standing together outside a building called Riverview, lingering near its entrance as though still working through some unresolved errand from that first disastrous excursion. Bremen, who told you the truthful version of events, who watched 3 friends die in the opening minutes of an assault he never wanted, goes on following Farwell around regardless, never eating, never sleeping, standing quietly by his bedside whenever Farwell finally rests. Whatever resentment Bremen clearly carries about that day, whatever bitterness colours his private account of what actually happened, it never translates into any visible break between the two of them. He remains, by every appearance, loyal, a survivor still tethered to the very leadership that nearly cost him his life, perhaps because loyalty, once it's been tested that severely and survived, becomes its own kind of habit, harder to abandon than the truth it's been asked to overlook. The captain's extorted city. Cheydinhal's Guard has always been a fairly ordinary institution, the kind of civic fixture nobody thinks much about until something changes. Something did change, not long before you ever arrive in the city, with the appointment of a new captain of the Guard named Ulrich Leland. It doesn't take long, once he's settled into the role, for the effects of that appointment to ripple visibly through the entire population. A change so pronounced that citizens date the city's decline directly to the moment he took charge. The shift is immediate and impossible to ignore if you spend any real time in Cheydinhal talking to its residents. Fines, once a routine, minor consequence of minor infractions, have become something closer to a citywide extraction scheme. People describe the change with genuine fear rather than simple annoyance, saying it's grown almost frightening just to walk the streets under Ulrich's watch. New penalties seem to appear for offences that barely existed before, as though the Guard has started inventing laws specifically to justify charging fines for breaking them. And the consequences of failing to pay aren't gentle. Property gets seized outright. People end up thrown into the castle dungeons over debts they never should have owed in the first place. A system that punishes poverty as harshly as it punishes crime. Levana Nedaren is the resident most willing to speak openly against what's happening, and she's the one who first connects a name to the general sense of dread settling over the city. Ulrich Leland, she'll tell you, is the reason everything changed, and the clearest, most devastating example of what his new regime actually costs ordinary people belongs to a man named Aldous Othran, a citizen who lost his own home entirely because he couldn't keep up with the fines being levied against him, seemingly for nothing more serious than a bit of public drunkenness and disorderly conduct that, under any reasonable captain, would have amounted to little more than a warning. Getting real confirmation of what's actually driving this, rather than simple overzealous law enforcement, requires talking to someone closer to Ulrich's own inner circle. Garrus Dorelion, his second in command, isn't initially willing to discuss his superior openly, and it takes real effort, real trust carefully built over time, before he'll say anything meaningful at all. Once he does open up, what emerges isn't a portrait of a captain who simply believes in strict enforcement for its own sake. Garrus voices genuine suspicion about where all this fine money is actually ending up. Suspicion that suggests Ulrich isn't funneling it toward the city's coffers or the Guard's own resources at all, but somewhere considerably more personal. A private fortune growing quietly while the citizens who fund it lose their homes. The tragedy at the center of this investigation belongs to Aldous himself, and it unfolds with a bleak inevitability once you actually witness it directly. Confronted with the reality of having lost his home over fines he simply couldn't pay, Aldous does something desperate. He confronts the Guard standing outside his own former house, trying, in whatever way he can manage, to reclaim what's been taken from him. It ends exactly how confrontations between an unarmed, desperate citizen and an armed Guard tend to end. Aldous dies there, on the doorstep of the home Ulrich's fines cost him, a direct casualty of a system built specifically to extract money from people who could least afford to lose it. His death barely more than a footnote in the larger scheme that produced it. That death becomes the turning point, the piece of evidence finally sharp enough to move against Ulrich directly. Whether justice arrives through Levana's preferred method, a more permanent, violent solution carried out in the privacy of her own home, involving paralysis and a pair of hungry tunnel rats, or through Garrus's more measured approach of gathering hard evidence, breaking into Ulrich's private quarters, and recovering a suspicious letter that seals his guilt in writing. The underlying truth remains the same either way. This wasn't a strict captain enforcing the law a little too zealously out of misguided civic duty. This was a man using his badge and his authority to systematically extort the very population he was sworn to protect, turning the machinery of civic order into a personal source of income at the direct expense of people like Aldous Othran, who had nothing to defend himself with beyond the desperate act of confronting a Guard outside a house that no longer belonged to him. What makes Ulrich's story land differently than some of Cyrodiil's more theatrical hidden villains is how mundane the whole scheme is, and how visible its effects were the entire time, right out in the open. If anyone with the authority to intervene had bothered to look closely at where the money was actually going. Nobody needed to break into a secret basement or uncover a forbidden ritual to know something was wrong in Cheydinhal. The finds themselves were public knowledge. The fear was public knowledge. The only thing hidden was the specific proof of where the extorted gold ended up, and even that took nothing more exotic than a single letter, tucked away in a guard captain's private room, to finally confirm what half the city had already suspected out loud for months, whispered between neighbors who'd already learned the hard way to keep their doors locked and their coin purses light whenever a guardsman happened to pass. There's a particular unease worth sitting with in the fact that Ulrich's authority was never actually illegitimate on paper. He genuinely held the rank of captain of the guard. His guards genuinely enforced the fines he set, and in the eyes of anyone unfamiliar with the details, they were simply doing their jobs, upholding whatever laws their captain decided the city needed. That's precisely what makes this kind of corruption so insidious compared to something like Glartha's private murder scheme or Raynald Drallis's staged vampire killings. Ulrich never had to hide in shadows or plant false evidence. He simply used the legitimate machinery of civic law enforcement as the vehicle for his own theft, wrapping extortion in the respectable language of fines and penalties until it became almost impossible for an ordinary citizen to tell where legitimate enforcement ended and outright robbery began. It's also worth remembering that Aldous Othran, the man whose death finally galvanizes real action against Ulrich, likely never set out to become the catalyst for anyone's downfall. He was simply a man who lost his home, confronting the nearest guard he could find in a moment of desperate, understandable anger. His death changes nothing for him personally. It simply provides, for everyone else in Cheydinhal, the final piece of evidence needed to finally act on suspicions they'd been quietly nursing for longer than anyone would likely admit out loud. A grim reminder that sometimes justice in Cyrodiil only arrives after someone has already paid for it with their life. There's a small, almost mechanical detail worth including here as well, one that captures exactly how thoroughly Ulrich's corruption reshaped the city while it lasted. For as long as he holds his post, every fine issued anywhere in Cheydinhal runs noticeably higher than the standard rate found elsewhere in Cyrodiil, a markup applied so uniformly across every offence that it reads less like individual guardsmen abusing their discretion and more like a deliberate policy handed down from the top. Once Ulrich is finally dealt with, whatever the method, that inflated rate quietly resets to normal, an entire city's cost of minor wrongdoing dropping back to something ordinary the moment its architect is removed. It's a strange kind of proof, the sort that never shows up in any dialogue or journal entry, sitting instead in the simple arithmetic of what a citizen owes before Ulrich's arrival, during his tenure, and after his fall. 3 numbers that tell the story of his corruption as plainly as anything Garrus or Levana ever said aloud. There's also something worth considering in how Garrus himself handles the whole affair. Once trust has finally been earned and evidence has finally been gathered, he never once suggests confronting Ulrich openly, never proposes bringing the matter before the Count as a straightforward accusation backed by testimony alone. Every path he offers relies instead on quiet, careful maneuvering. A suspicious letter recovered by stealth. An ally willing to take matters into her own hands under cover of privacy. Options that suggest Garrus understood something important about the man he served under. That Ulrich's position, his rank, his standing with the Count, made him functionally untouchable through ordinary means. It took theft, or violence, or both, to finally undo what legitimate procedure alone had proven powerless to touch. A small but telling detail about just how thoroughly a corrupt official can insulate himself once he's climbed high enough inside a system built to protect its own. The guest who was never a guest. The All Saints Inn sits in the temple district of the Imperial City, an unremarkable establishment run by a publican named Willett, offering beds and food to travelers the way any inn in any city does. For most of the game, nothing about it draws any particular attention. Guests come and go. Rooms get rented in the basement, 3 of them, each modest and well lit, indistinguishable from countless similar rooms scattered across the province. It's the kind of background location easy to walk past a dozen times without ever really registering who's staying inside. The sort of place a traveller might spend a single night and never think of again. One of those guests is a Breton woman named Marguerite Diel. If you happened to notice her at all during an early visit to the inn, there would have been nothing to distinguish her from any other patron passing through. She's not attached to any quest. She has no reputation preceding her, no rumours circulating about strange behaviour, no locked basement or suspicious schedule to draw suspicion. She simply exists there, indistinguishably folded into the general population of the Imperial City, dressed in the same modest, lower-class clothing you'd expect of any ordinary traveller. The sort of person 100 different guests might have shared a meal near without a second thought. That anonymity is, in a very real sense, the entire point. Somewhere beneath Cyrodiil, in a secret shrine buried within Lake Arius caverns, a cult devoted to Mehrunes Dagon has spent considerable time and effort placing its own members throughout the province's cities, embedding them among ordinary citizens specifically, so they'd never draw attention before the moment came to reveal themselves. A significant number of Mythic Dawn agents live exactly this way, blending seamlessly into the general population of everyday townsfolk, indistinguishable from anyone else going about an unremarkable daily routine, gathering information and quietly supporting the cult's larger ambitions, without ever revealing themselves through so much as a careless word. Marguerite Diel is one of them. For as long as the Mythic Dawn's central shrine remains undiscovered and untouched, agents like Marguerite have no reason to reveal themselves at all. Their entire value lies in remaining unremarkable, in being exactly the kind of person nobody thinks twice about, right up until the moment they're needed for something more direct. That moment arrives specifically once the shrine at Lake Arius Caverns is finally infiltrated, and the Mysterium Xarxes, a text of enormous significance to the cult, is stolen from directly under their leadership's watch. Word of that theft evidently reaches every embedded agent across the province simultaneously, flipping some kind of switch that had, until then, kept them content to sit quietly in taverns and inns, waiting for orders that might never come, patient in a way that borders on unsettling once you understand what that patience was actually in service of. From that point forward, Marguerite Diel is no longer simply an anonymous guest at the All Saints Inn. She appears alongside another sleeper agent, a Nord named Styrbjorn. Both of them now openly hostile, both carrying orders to track down and kill whoever was responsible for infiltrating their shrine. The transformation is immediate and total. The same woman who spent an unknown stretch of time occupying a room at that inn without drawing a single moment of suspicion, now summons Daedric armor and weapons the instant she spots her target, fighting with the same practiced ease as any other member of the Mythic Dawn's ranks, calling on a major shield spell and a minor shock spell, alongside the standard bound mace and armor. Every initiate seems trained to summon at will. What lingers about Marguerite's story isn't the confrontation itself, which plays out fairly similarly to encounters with any number of other hostile agents once the cult's true colors come out. It's the stretch of time before that confrontation, the unknown and unknowable period during which she simply existed, unnoticed, in a building full of ordinary people going about ordinary lives, carrying whatever private allegiance to Mehrunes Dagon she'd sworn without a single visible sign of it. Nobody at the inn seems to have suspected a thing. Willett never mentions anything unusual about her. No rumour ever circulated suggesting anything was amiss with the quiet Breton woman renting a room in the Temple district. No whispered warning the way Skingrad's guards volunteered about Glarthir. No torture chamber rumour drifting through the beggar network the way word travelled about Leowin's castle. She simply wasn't the kind of presence anyone thought to question. Based on what we understand about how these embedded agents operated more broadly across Cyrodiil's cities, this kind of anonymity wasn't accidental or incidental to their purpose. It was, in every sense, the entire design. A visible cultist can be watched, questioned, arrested. An invisible one, folded seamlessly into the daily rhythm of an ordinary city, can gather information indefinitely, can wait as long as necessary, can exist for months or years as nothing more than a face in a crowded tavern, until the day finally comes when waiting is no longer required, and the mask comes off all at once, without warning, without any of the slow unraveling that exposed so many of the other secrets we've walked through tonight. Once the crisis passes, once Martin Septim lights the dragonfires and the immediate threat of the Mythic Dawn's ambitions finally comes to an end, Marguerite Deal simply vanishes from the world entirely, along with Styrbjorn, her purpose exhausted, her cover no longer needed, her presence erased from the Imperial City as completely and quietly as it had once been maintained. It leaves behind an unsettling thought worth sitting with, one that applies well beyond this single case. How many other faces passed without comment through Cyrodiil's inns and taverns during those same uncertain months, carrying secrets nobody ever had reason to ask about, simply because nobody ever had reason to look, sharing tables and doorways and quiet nods of greeting with people who had, all along, been waiting for a war that hadn't started yet. There's a particular quality to Marguerite's story that separates it from nearly everything else we've walked through tonight, and it's worth naming directly. Every other secret on this list required some form of active investigation to surface: a stolen diary, a missing apprentice, a journal hidden behind a cupboard, a lever pulled inside a barrel. Someone, somewhere, had to go looking on purpose, pulling one thread until the whole fabric of a lie came loose. Marguerite's secret never required any of that. It surfaced entirely on its own timetable, triggered not by anyone's curiosity, but by a single, unrelated event happening in a cave system many miles away from the inn where she'd been quietly waiting. In a sense, her story is the most honest illustration of how fragile the boundary between ordinary and hidden really is throughout this entire province. She wasn't waiting to be discovered. She was simply waiting, full stop, for a signal that had nothing to do with whether anyone around her ever grew suspicious. It's worth wondering too, what her life at that inn actually looked like day to day before the theft of the Mysterium Xarxes changed everything. Did she make idle conversation with other guests over dinner? Did she nod politely to Willett each morning on her way out? Did she, in whatever spare hours a sleeper agent might have, do anything resembling an ordinary life? Or was every moment of that stay simply a performance sustained indefinitely, waiting for orders that, for all she might have known, could have taken years to arrive? The game never answers that question, and perhaps that's exactly the point. Some hidden lives end in confrontation and revelation. Others simply exist, patiently, in rooms we walk past without ever knowing to ask. Compare her, for a moment, to Amantius Electus back in the Temple District, or to Falcar behind his locked basement door in Cheydinhal. Both of those men were, in their own ways, actively building something, cultivating a private project that eventually grew large enough to leave physical evidence behind for someone determined enough to find it. Marguerite left nothing behind at all. No diary, no stained floorboards, no missing apprentice. Her entire existence at the All Saints Inn, for however long it lasted, could have ended without a single trace, could have concluded with her simply packing a bag one morning and vanishing from the Imperial City, without anyone ever learning what she'd truly been. The only reason her story ever gets told at all is that history happened to intervene, that a theft in a cavern many miles away forced her hand before she ever had the chance to slip away unnoticed. It's a reminder that not every secret in Cyrodiil gets uncovered through cleverness or persistence. Some simply get interrupted, mid-sentence, by events entirely outside anyone's control. Marguerite's situation is actually somewhat unusual even among her fellow cultists, and that distinction is worth drawing out clearly rather than glossing over. Most of the Mythic Dawn's other embedded operatives, agents like Gilles and Severi Farum, positioned to spy on Cloud Ruler Temple in preparation for a strike on Bruma, don't simply sit quietly in the world waiting to be noticed the way Marguerite does. Based on how their presence is structured, they seem to exist within Cyrodiil only once the specific chain of events calling for them has already been set in motion. Appearing abruptly at the moment their storyline requires it, and vanishing again once it resolves, rather than living for the whole game as background townsfolk, the way Marguerite does at the All Saints Inn. Marguerite, by contrast, appears to be the rarer case. A sleeper agent who exists as an ordinary member of the population from the very beginning, indistinguishable from any other guest passing through that inn for as long as the wider story allows her to remain that way. That makes her, if anything, a more unsettling example than her fellow agents, rather than simply a representative one, a reminder that the cult's patience with at least some of its assets ran deeper than a scripted appearance timed to a single quest. There's also a woman known as El's God-Hater, tucked inside a Skingrad inn, who seems to share at least some of that same quiet, unremarkable quality, remaining out of sight and out of trouble for as long as nobody happens to cross her path during her active hours. Whether her presence in the world follows the same pattern as Marguerite's, persisting from the very start rather than snapping into existence at a scripted trigger, isn't something we can say with full confidence, but the broader shape of the Mythic Dawn strategy still comes through clearly enough. Either way, a cult willing to plant at least some of its people so deeply into ordinary daily life that even the game itself, in its own quiet way, treats them as though they'd always simply belonged there.